Good morning. First of all, I think we should all get a gold medal for being here at this hour of the morning. I hope you'll let the folks who couldn't quite make it in know just how dedicated you really are to these issues. I know all of our panelists really appreciate your presence here. My name is Beto Juárez. I am a professor here at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. I had the honor of working with a number of people in the room, and I just want to take a moment to thank the folks here at the law school who are responsible for the program that we are going to be hearing today. I think that in particular it's important to recognize the critical role that the students on the Water Law Review play, certainly Sarah and Lindsay in their key leadership roles, but I think all of the students on the Water Law Review do an amazing job. And of course, you've just heard from my colleague, Professor Tom Romero, but I also want to recognize Justice Hobbs, who all of you in this room know, who plays such an important role here at the law school, and we are so fortunate to have him as part of our teaching corps here at the law school. We are going to begin by talking about preserving and protecting the Chicano-Chicanas water heritage. And I think the panelists that we have today really are going to do an amazing job of setting off our discussion this morning and are also going to really be able to demonstrate some of the things that Professor Romero was just talking about in terms of community-based action. So what I thought would be helpful for us just to sort of begin to frame that discussion would be to have some visual images of the water, the history of water in the Southwest. Of course, that has to do with lots of different aspects of this, but here our panelists are going to be talking about, in particular, about the importance of acequias. This whole concept here of an irrigation system that was developed in the early history of the Southwest, initially under the Spanish Empire and later when these lands were part of Mexico. And so here you can see examples of acequias in Colorado, in Nuevo Mexico, and in Texas. So these were part of the fundamental infrastructure of the development of the Southwest. And the questions that are confronted today and that our panelists will be talking about will deal with the challenges that these historic communities face in trying to maintain this history and this tradition, and to simply be able to do something very basic, which is to continue to make a living off the land. And water, of course, is fundamental to that. I'm going to, not going to introduce our panelists with their full biographies. I simply want, you can read them in the program, and I think it's more important for them to be able to speak. And we're going to have each of them talk for about 12 minutes with the hope that we're then going to actually be able to have some time for conversation with you and comments and questions from the audience, which I think is always such an important part of these kinds of events. But I do want to sort of frame how I have been thinking about these very distinguished panelists. We're going to begin first by hearing from Mr. José Martinez, who is to my immediate left, who lives in San Francisco, Colorado, in the San Luis Valley, and who is a longtime activist in his community and a board member of the Land Rights Council. He will then be followed by Junita Martinez, who also lives in San Francisco. You might have surmised that, yes, they are married. And she likewise is a longtime community activist and a board member of the Sangre de Cristo Acequia Association. Junita will be followed by David Benavides, who is also a community activist in many respects, and but also will bring his perspective as a lawyer who has many, many years of experience working on these issues in New Mexico. He is the managing attorney of the Land and Water Project for New Mexico Legal Aid. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Dr. Devin Peña, who also is a longtime community activist and founder and president of the Acequia Institute, but also has a side job as a professor at the University of Washington. And he will be able to share with us some of his perspective as an academic who has delved into these issues. So with no further ado, if I may, I would like to ask Mr. Martinez to kick off our discussion, please.
From here?
Wherever you would like. You are welcome to sit down if you would like. Your preference.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. It's an honor for us to be given the opportunity to kind of explain how our Acequia system works and how we utilize it and how it benefits the people that live in our area of Colorado, which is kind of, we call it the Culebra Basin. It's south, it's only 10 miles away from the New Mexico border. And we have a very unique system. We have a water system that it's made up of many cañones or canyons. In the place where we live, it's kind of east of the Sangre de Cristo range. And the area where we live, there was a land grant that was given to our forefathers many years ago. And it entails a total of about 9 cañones within 20-mile distance of the Sangre de Cristo range. And starting from the north to the south, we have the Pozo is the first cañon. A pozo means like a hole, and it was given that name by the early pioneers because it looks like if you go up to the mountain first and look down, it's like a big hole, and that's the first cañon that brings water into the Chama area. And then next is actually the Chama, El Cañón de Chama, which is the Canyon of Chama. And that particular cañon is actually the biggest one and the more spread out. It has a lot of beautiful vegas down below. And from that cañon, another river meets the one that comes from El Pozo. So when it gets down to the bottom of the mountain, we have actually 3 rivers that come together and becomes one. And out of that river is where people irrigate from. And then the next one south of that is what they call North Vallejo and South Vallejo, which are also 2 cañones that bring water down from the mountains. And they also meet at the very bottom of the mountains and becomes one river. And that cañon is where people in that particular area use the water to irrigate. And then the next one over is Vallejos, is another cañon that comes down from the mountains. It's an interesting configuration of how these cañones were made originally. And they also use the water from that river to irrigate their lands down below. And then the next one over is ours, which is San Francisco Creek or river. And that's the little town of San Francisco where we live. And we have approximately a little over 1,100 acres that we irrigate. So I'm going to kind of concentrate where I live because I know more about that than the other cañones. But let me finish the other cañones. South of us is El Torcido, which means the twisted one. And then Los Cuates, which is another 2 small cañones that meet up there. And then it's Jaroso. So those are the different canyons that we have that brings water down to the people that irrigate in that particular area of Colorado. For some of you that don't know what an acequia is, let me try to kind of put a picture in your mind of what an acequia is. An acequia is actually a diversion from the main rivers that come down at a point where they installed, back in the days when the early pioneers came, they put a huge water gate there. And then from there, they divert the water to different acequias. The one thing that amazes me a lot is when I irrigate, I have a lot of time to concentrate and meditate. And I look at how these acequias were made, and it totally blows my mind to think that people back in those days were able to figure out the terrain and how they could make these acequias to go to every property that that people have in that area. Excuse me. And we have about 76 parciantes, or water irrigators, that are part of the irrigation system in our cañon. And it's very interesting because from the main gate, we have first what we call Acequia number 1, and then that one irrigates all the lands from the south to the north. And then we have what we call the Nana ditch, or the mother ditch. And the mother ditch comes right in back of our house, and then that serves to irrigate all the lands from the north to the south. Now, the number 1 ditch is only one ditch, and it goes straight from the east to the west. And all the properties are north of that one. So every property gets to irrigate from that ditch. However, on the other Acequia Nana, that one becomes a total of 6 ditches because of the fact that the properties are more spread out on the south side. So every parciante has a ditch that they can utilize to be able to water, their alfalfas and their grass. And it's very interesting, and it's beautiful. That part of Colorado is kind of a piece of Colorado that very many people know about. However, there's a lot of history there in San Luis. We live in the little town of San Francisco, which is 9 miles southeast of San Luis. And from what I understand, when the pioneers first came in and they started to develop this small little towns all over the place, after they were settled and built their adobe homes and everything, then obviously they wanted to start to plant, and be able to sustain themselves. So at that time is when they started to figure how to make these acequias. And oh my God, like I said, it really blows my mind to see how they figured all that out to serve every parciante in that area. And it's the same thing with the other cañones, the same thing, the same concept, that they use to be able to look at the terrain and follow the higher areas that the water would go down to. And it's something that I'm just very amazed. And like I said, when I up there in my field irrigating, I look at that and I just thank the good Lord that we had some people that knew what they were doing back in those days. And now we are the ones that are able to take advantage of that and irrigate from this acequias, which is a neat system. And another thing that happens with that, with the acequia system, is that we are always hoping for good moisture and a lot of snow during the winter. For example, like last year, we had some beautiful, beautiful snowfalls down there. I mean, we had a lot of snow. I spent 2 months shoveling snow around my house, and I actually had like a fence all the way around my house of a pile of snow because I wanted to get it away from the house to be able to get in and out. And we had plenty of water, and it was wonderful because the harvest that we had last year was plentiful. In some areas, it increased quite a bit as far as how much I harvested. And I have 10 acres that I irrigate from the ditch number 3. And for example, I normally get about 400 bales of hay out of that one. And last year I was able to get 537, which is the most I've ever gotten. However, this year is a lot different. We're having problems with the fact that we don't have enough snow and moisture in that area. So we're hoping for a lot of rain and hopefully some more snows, because if we don't get enough, obviously it affects all the pacientes and the farmers there. And we're not going to be able to have a good crop. And most of the people down there, they have, cattle, horses, and they're the ones that depend more on being able to harvest a good crop. I don't have any cows or horses anymore because I sold everything, when I retired and we went back home, my wife and I. So I gave all that up. But I still irrigate my land and I harvest it and then I sell it to whoever, I can find to sell it to. And usually we get anywhere from $9 to $15 a bale, depending on where you sell it. So it brings in a little bit of income for all of us. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys an idea as to how the people have been irrigating in that area for very many years, for over 150 years. And it's something that if you ever get a chance to go to San Luis and look at our vega, which is the commons, it's the only common left in the United States of about 500 acres that the people use to bring their animals there in the summer. And while they're growing their alfalfas and their grasses, and then when they cut, bale, and bring it in, then they go and get their animals out of La Vega, out of the commons. Like I said, it's the only commons that we have in the United States. And if you ever get a chance to go over there and see San Luis, there's a lot of things you can see over there that are really, really interesting. So with this, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be able to share this with you.
If I may now ask Mrs. Martinez to continue our discussion.
Sounds good. I hope you all can hear me. I'm a big ham. I like this setting. I'm really cheesy too. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm thrilled to talk about something I know very well. From a Chicana's perspective on the Acequia, our Acequia is the San Francisco Ditch Company. It's an Acequia that's been in existence for over 100 years. But I can tell you that our Acequia is forward-looking. José didn't mention that he was the president of the Comisión. A Comisión is every community that he mentioned, every cañón, the community members select 3 people from their own community to oversee the Acequias. And they are the president, the secretary, and a treasurer. José was selected to be a president in our annual meeting. We only have a meeting once a year to discuss the Acequia. It's a governance type of board. And in our Acequia, I'm glad to say that under José's tenure, we were able to have 2 women occupy the secretary and treasurer position, and of course a man is still the president, but that could change. But the guys who did it were very upset. They were upset. They said, how can we call the Comisión and we have a problem on the ditch and the Comisión has to come out and these ladies are working? And José would tell them, listen, we need to give them an opportunity to prove themselves. And maybe they don't know as much about the Acequia as the mayordomo or you all, but we need to give them a chance to perform their duties because we need to enter the 21st century and not keep those old ideas. Now that's one of the old ideas that I really appreciate, that we did enter the 21st century. These ladies are phenomenal. The guys have come around, and they appreciate that. In an acequia like ours, we have an annual meeting. At the annual meeting, everybody who's a landowner and has the water right to irrigate on the acequia, they come into a small room, and what we do is we saludar one another, which means we shake hands or we say, how you doing, even though we just saw them a couple hours earlier. It doesn't matter. But we get together, and then the talk always is about the business that needs to be conducted. So, at the annual meeting, you elect a new comisión. And I'm glad to say that in our annual meeting, our president and the treasurer, the two ladies and secretary, stayed on, as well as our mayordomo, who is a ditch rider. That's the best description we can give you. In our acequia too, I need to tell you that in a lot of ways it's the most democratic process you can imagine. For example, José and I own the same property. So a lot of you would own a house, you own it together with your spouse or a friend or your partner. It doesn't matter, but there are probably 2 and maybe 3 people on your home. Well, imagine this, that you're going to an acequia meeting, and it's still very sexist. I have to say that. It is. It's a very man thing where women have just in the last 5 years, I would say, started coming into the annual meetings in their own communities and participating. And the men, when they're together, they do the election, but only José can vote, or I can vote on one issue. For example, if they're going to vote on raising the dues of the properties so that they have a fund, José will say okay or not. If we did it both together, they'll right away say, oh, no, it's only one man, one vote. One person, one vote. So that's why it's democratic. It's different than on a mutual ditch. And a lot of you probably know mutual ditches better. Mutual ditches, I think, are very greedy. Mutual ditches are bad. And the reason why I think that is because on a mutual ditch, José could have 50 shares in that ditch, and I only have my little 5. Well, who's going to have a bigger voice in that ditch? That's the inequity. José would have more power in that vote than I would. But in our system, we do have ranchers that have over 100 acres, and they're only allowed 1 vote. And to me, that's very democratic. That is also equitable, because even though their interests are for them, my interests are still represented. For me. So in that way, I like the acequia. Am I still on time, Beto?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. I can get carried away here. But I wanted to also say that as a community, as women on the acequia, we deal with different problems. For example, when the water's scarce, you can almost bet there's going to be problems. José didn't tell you that one year we had the drought, and we had a gentleman who had just planted his alfalfa field. And when you plant a new field, you need water right away. Well, there isn't any water that year. So he came to the comisión, he came to José and the other 2 gentlemen at that time, and asked that we skip over a few people and give him the water because he really needed it. In our kind of community setting, you look at the need and then determine a decision. That's why you have a comisión. And we failed to tell one person on that ditch turn. One person, and it was deadly almost. Because he took the water, started irrigating. But Jean, our senior member in our community, he saw the water go right by. He said, "What? What's going on? How come he's got the water?" And they got in a fight, and the fight escalated, and Gene ended up pulling out a gun and somebody else, and it was crazy. And it was hilarious. It was like a Keystone Cops thing. And women there, we just roll our eyes. We say, "Oh my God, these guys with their guns and whatever." And I hate to say that. I don't mean to be flippant. This is very serious stuff. But afterwards, you can laugh at it. The whole community does laugh about it now. But at the time, it was really serious. And then you get SWAT teams coming in, and they make a big deal out of it. And José had already settled the problem. He had already calmed down the neighbors. And we just feel that just talking to your neighbor settles a lot of problems. So it did, but it escalated. And that's one of the dangers about drought time and living on the Acequia, that if there's not good communication, it's vital. It's actually very, very vital. And people hold grudges, and they say, "He stole the water last year," or "He's liable to take this and that." So you get the very basic human emotions when you are on the Acequia. But I also need to tell you that on the Acequia, when the times are hard, and our neighbors do need the water, and they ask for it, then the community itself, or those acequeros, the people who irrigate, they do come together and they do discuss it, and they try their best to find a resolution. On a mutual ditch, you'll never see that. You'll see them with the one with the most, walk away with the most. And in this system, I believe it's equitable and it's helpful to our community because everybody's voice is heard. And I also wanted to tell you that I live in a small village. I think there's about 60, maybe 90 people there. It is a historical village. We have a morada. A morada is a religious building where penitentes go and they pray. And today, if many of you don't know, today is this week has been Semana Santa. Today is Holy Friday, Viernes Santo. So in our community today, there is no fights about water. All of our community is participating in the morada today. They pray mostly for water. And we're a community that's very religiously based. We're not a perfect community by all means. And we're very traditional. Everybody knows their role. It may be difficult, it is difficult sometimes for my daughters to come in because they're so modernized with a greater city environment. But they're learning that there's order and structure. There is order and structure where we live. It may not make sense to other people, but it makes sense to us. And we take it seriously. Our religious backgrounds, our morada, we have our regular church there. Everything is closed in or enclosed closely. Even the cemeteries right there in the community. So that you can actually conceivably be born in our community, get married in our local church, attend all the traditional activities we have year-round, and be buried in our same community. Now, I know that's kind of hard to conceive with such a mobile community that we have here. All of you have traveled even around the world. And they have viejitos or old people who used to say that, "Oh, I've gone far, I've gone as far as San Agustín." That's only like 20 miles away. So, and we laugh at that because, of course, we even think we're doing something big because we're in Denver. Oh my God. But, so the cultural values that we have are very traditional and very important to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. David, can you continue our discussion, please?
Sure, and In the packet that everyone was given is a piece that I wrote, and I would ask you, it would be useful to you to pull it out. There'll be some passages from it I'll be referring to. I don't know if people are missing it, if you can look over someone else's shoulder or something like that. So I'm an attorney. I work with New Mexico Legal Aid. We provide free legal services on a variety of civil issues, and I work on land and water issues, mostly water, but also with land grants, and mostly with, on my water work, mostly with acequias. And there are innumerable types of water issues and water problems that, that the communities would have that I would work with them on, including adjudication of water rights, governance issues, fights, easements, and that type of thing. But what I want to talk about is water transfers, because our office and the communities we work with has spent quite a bit of time talking about water transfers. And so the first thing I want to direct your attention to is the very first passage that I quoted from Helen Ingram. And I guess for those who, do some of you not have it? Because I'll read some of the stuff if you don't have it. Are you being shy? Okay, good. That's good. If you can see, Helen writes, water symbolizes such values as opportunity, security, and self-determination. Strong communities are able to hold on to their water and put it to work. Communities that lose control over water probably will fail in trying to control much else of importance. So this is really important, because in my experience, this is exactly how communities regard water, regardless of what the written law says. Or what the written law might tell you about the nature of water in the West. In fact, this is the nature of water in the West, and communities understand this instinctively, both parts of it. The part that says what water symbolizes, and the part that says that your ability to control water in your community is a test of the health of your community and your community's prospects for its survival and its future. That's how people actually behave with regard to water, again, regardless of what's written in the law. And because the law allows for water to be moved out of a community through the process of transfers, there is an inherent tension in the law between water as a freely movable and transferable personal asset that an individual person can do with what they want, versus water forming part of the identity of the community, and the idea that an individual taking an action like this has an effect on the community. And so that, I mean, that encapsulates most of the significant water issues in the West over the last 30 or 40 years, that kind of tension. And you might imagine that in our increasingly polarized society, that this is a source of polarization between these two concepts or ideas. But interestingly, in my experience, it's not in a way. And what I mean by that is those places in New Mexico and those legislators in New Mexico or community leaders who I know to be the most ideologically pro-private property oriented, when they come to me and say, oh my God, they're trying to export water from our community, David, what are we going to do? They're not talking about in the language of private property. They are talking in the language of Helen Ingram. They're talking about the community's security and their self-determination, that type of thing. So, so that's it's interesting that the Helen Ingram concept trumps out over the other when it's your own community's water rights at stake, and the private property ideology kind of goes away. Anyways, water transfers are permitted by law, but it's a highly regulated process. At least in New Mexico it is, and I think in most Western states, where you have to get a permit, usually from a state agency like the state engineer, to transfer the location or the type of use of a water right. And so the question comes up, can this government process, this administrative agency permit process, incorporate or capture what Helen Ingram is talking about, or not? In other words, can we recognize when we as a society or as a state are about to go too far in compromising a community's opportunity, a community's security or self-determination, and say, no, we will not allow this type of transfer? So that's the question that we struggle with in New Mexico. And so in the past, the answer would have been, gee, we don't see anything in the law very much that addresses what Helen Ingram was talking about. But in 1985 and 1987, there were changes to New Mexico's law, and so on the middle of page 2, there's a box with large type, and you can see what the current standard is for transfers in New Mexico, that any or all or any part of the right may be severed from the land or may be transferred to other purposes, and then there's 3 criteria. If such changes can be made without 1, detriment to existing water rights, 2, not contrary to conservation of water within the state, and 3, not detrimental to the public welfare of the state. So in particular, that last one, the detriment to the public welfare, that's a very broad, some would say subjective standard. That seemed to many people, particularly to the Acequias in New Mexico, to be a way that maybe the law can capture or incorporate what Helen Ingram is talking about in that initial quote. Now, just another word about Acequias beyond what we've heard already. This whole idea of meetings and elected officers in New Mexico, and I believe to some extent under Colorado law, a new statute, is in statute. So there's 2 whole articles of New Mexico statutes that deal with the governance of Acequias, elections, mayordomos, the powers of Acequias, and that type of thing. And so New Mexico statutes have incorporated really what was Acequias, and the land grants in New Mexico come, of course, from a civil law tradition where there's community management and community control over certain assets. You talked about the Vega in San Luis, the common lands. That's very much in the same tradition. So of course the Acequias are going to be very much on the community-oriented side of things. And so the idea of a water transfer to many people in Acequia communities of an individual being able, over the objection of a community, to transfer a water right is a very foreign idea to many of the people I work with. The water right belongs to the land, not to the person, or belongs to the community, not to the person. But the idea that it's a personal asset and it can be picked up and removed and moved elsewhere, again, over the objection of the community, seems absurd. So in New Mexico, there's around 700 acequias, and so, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Is that 5? Okay, thank you. So the first test of this of the statute was a case called the sleeper case, that case is on. There's a quote from it on page 3. After the judge heard testimony, this was a water transfer from an acequia to a resort some distance away from the community. And you can see in the quote what the judge decided as far as public welfare. Now, he was using the language about contrasting agriculture to like a playground for those who can pay, but what was he really doing? He was doing what Helen Ingram was talking about. He was protecting the community. He was giving the community back its control over the water from a process that was trying to take it away. Interestingly, they lost on appeal. Why did they lose on appeal? Because the transfer was first proposed before public welfare was put in the New Mexico statute, and the judge read it into there without it actually being in the statute. And so this was around the time I was in law school, and I knew I was going to be doing this work, and so I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is the next step is to represent an acequia on a transfer, put on the same case they put on a sleeper. Now that public welfare is in the statute, we should get a result that won't get overturned on appeal. But 2 things happened in New Mexico, probably in reaction to sleeper. One is that the state engineer who makes these decisions tried very much to distance themselves from the idea of public welfare and that they had to do it in the law. They were in total denial over that. The other thing that happened is the people who wanted to transfer water rights, they were driven underground. Everyone in New Mexico, no one will publicly do anything other than give great lip service to acequias, but regardless of what they privately think. And so out of guilt of what happened with the land grants, or out of just a strategic, out of a strategy, people try to hide what they were doing as far as transfers. And so people only find out about transfers because they get published in the legal notices of the paper. They were trying to publish it in the smallest circulation newspaper they could find that met the statute. They were bringing proposals to the state engineer and saying, this is not really a transfer. They were doing anything to keep the public welfare from actually coming up. And the state engineer was running just as fast from that idea. And so what grew out of that for us was that total lack of faith that the state engineer, even if we were able to like force them, look, you must evaluate the public welfare, that they would make the right decision. We had very little faith that that was going to happen. And so the idea came up of Acequia's being able to make their own decisions on transfers. That came out of a project that we worked on with the city and county of Santa Fe. And the most surprising thing about that is that I think the state engineer got tired of us after all these years, and they actually agreed, and we now have a statute that says if an Acequia water right is proposed to be transferred, and if the Acequia has put into their bylaws that they have the decision-making power, that the initial decision over the transfer goes to the elected commission of the Acequia, and they decide to approve or not approve it. If they approve it, it still has to go to the state engineer under slightly different criteria for approval. If the Acequia does not approve it, then that's it. It stops right there. It does not go to the state engineer. So now Acequias can actually write decisions like the sleeper case. And in fact, this is what we see. There's a lot of statutes in a lot of Western states have a public welfare, public interest criteria. Well, how is that principle being articulated now in New Mexico? It's being articulated by the Acequias in their written decisions. Because the state engineer was not willing or interested in doing that. And so I think I don't know if I have 1 minute or if I'm done. 1 minute, thank you, okay. So of course, there's been a challenge to the statute. And so the very first challenge, the people challenging it said a number of things. They said, well, you know, the state engineer has always done this. The legislature surely didn't mean for the Acequias to do this. And they said, Acequias have only ever had decision-making power over allocating water. Surely the legislature didn't mean for them to have such momentous decision-making power as to do that. And it's funny because the court's response to that is, well, are you complaining about the legislature or is that a legal argument? The actual quote from the decision of the case was, owners do not explain what principles prohibit the legislature from delegating that authority to the commissioners of Acequia. In other words, they were snidely saying, you have not made a legal argument, you're just complaining about what the legislature did. And so the very last quote on the very last page is from that case, the Peña Blanca case, where the court did recognize that there is a legitimate reason for Acequia commissioners to be able to have this type of decision-making power. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Devin Peña. I understand Dr. Peña has a PowerPoint, so I just want to invite the panelists, the other panelists, if they'd like to take seats so you're not hurting your back trying to follow the slides.
I'll see if I can manage this. It's delightful to be here. It was nice to see Gregory again. When I think about Justice Hobbs, I always think about being in the willow thickets of an Acequia in San Luis in 2003 and really admiring you for being a Peace Corps volunteer back in the old days. That's when I think of him, I think of our Justice Hobbs as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'm an active learner and listener, so I want to make a couple of comments very quickly about some of the things that my colleagues have said. And one of the first things I would point out is if you look at our historic marker for the San Luis People's Ditch, and I have no idea because I'm a Mac person, maybe is this, how to negotiate, well, I'll just leave it there, that's fine. I don't know how many of you all have seen this marker. It's on the highway to Taos, coming out of San Luis on the left side, right by the Vega. And half the names are women. So now I want to make a distinction. I agree, there's a lot of sexism.
Yes.
That's not patriarchy. Patriarchy is a systematic system of oppressing women by not allowing them to own land, by not allowing them to own water, by not allowing them to serve on juries, by not allowing them to inherit property, and by not allowing them to serve on any governmental kind of organization. That wasn't true of us in 1851. Look at Janet LeComp's work, The Independent Women of Hispanic New Mexico. And you will learn women could serve on juries, they could vote, they could own land. In other words, yeah, there's sexism, there's machismo, but it's not the same thing as patriarchy, and I think we need to recognize that. That if you compare us with New England in 1851, women over there are oppressed under a patriarchal system. They can't serve on juries, they can't own property, all of it. And so I think we need to think about that again. You know, we dump on Chicano culture all the time as if we're uniquely sexist. We're not uniquely sexist. We're unique in not being patriarchal in 1851. I think that is worth noting. The other thing, it's not to, I think it is true that the Vega is the only municipal or village commons still used and governed by the original families. That is true. But there are 1,000 commons in New England, Boston Common among them. So we need to be careful of that. San Luis Vega is not the only commons in the United States. There's a whole bunch of them in New Mexico, as David was just pointing out, and there's a whole bunch of them in New England. Now, what's really interesting, and has implications for what we're talking about today, is that when the U.S. Supreme Court in U.S. versus Sandoval decided that there were only two kinds of property in the United States, right? Common and public, they forgot the commons. And yet, they didn't apply that ruling to New England commons. They walloped us with New Mexico and Colorado land grants. That's disparate behavior on the part of the courts. It's discriminatory behavior on the part of the courts. And I'm going to return to that because I do think that one of the challenges facing us surviving as Acequias is decisions made during a highly racist colonial period in our history in the 1890s. And I'm going to refer back to Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch and the Freehold decision in a moment. That's really a big threat to us. Now let me see if I can find my PowerPoint. Is this it? I'm not sure where my PowerPoint is. Right here. See, I never would have found it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh.
You're welcome.
There we go. Very good. All right, here we go. I called my presentation Decolonizing Water Law. And I'm really happy to be here, as I said. I think there's three principles that I'm going to kind of integrate into my discussion today. One is when Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch was decided in 1882, it basically said that the only water law true to place in Colorado was prior. But we're prior to prior. Does that make us less true to place? So that's where the racism starts. That's where the disparate impact begins, is when that monumental decision declares that there's one water law true to place in Colorado, it's called prior appropriation. That was a huge error of fact. And it's something that it took us over 100 years to deal with that, to get Governor Ritter and the state legislature in 2009 to pass our Colorado Acequia recognition law. To me, it's really amazing that the Comisión has survived, that the one irrigator, one vote system survived, because that wasn't the law for over 100 years. We weren't supposed to be doing it that way. But Acequia survived because we were under the radar. We weren't incorporated except for a handful, like the Cerro Ditch and the San Luis Peoples Ditch, which is one of the ditches that I irrigate on, because the anti-war poverty program of Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, had insisted that if we were going to borrow money from the federal anti-poverty programs to line our ditch with cement, we were going to have to incorporate as a mutual ditch company. And so even though we incorporated as a mutual ditch company on the SLPD, we governed ourselves as an Acequia. And I think it's really notable that we managed somehow for over 100 years to maintain an allegiance to our norms of governance as against those of prior appropriation. But we are, I think, one of the most important things for us to recognize in terms of critiquing settler colonial water law and embracing environmental justice ethics is to begin by saying we're prior to prior. That means something. That should mean something. The other thing, we need to recognize we already have created a lot of equity. And if you look at San Luis, the reason people come as tourists is the landscape we created. Our investments in the Acequia system created ecosystem services and economic-based services. Without us, there's no tourism. That's got to count. And I'll show you later on toward the end of my brief discussion how that should count. One of the things I've been doing, and frankly I'm still doing a lot of research on this, is to compare governance norms. Acequia versus appropriative rights, and there's some very important differences. I don't have a lot of time, so unfortunately I can't dwell on these, but I want to show you that for us, when we're talking about community value, I do have a pointer, don't I? When we're talking about community value, it's not an abstraction. Here it is. Here it is at the Corpus y Gallegos ranches, the late José Gallegos, may he rest in peace, he died, it'll be 2 years this December. Some of you, of course, knew Joe Gallegos, former commissioner, one of the co-founders of the Acequia Association and so on. We were doing the annual horneada, making chicos del horno, when I took this photo. That's what I mean by communality and indigeneity. It's not an abstraction, it's the real thing. I think it's really important also to understand something that's under threat, cooperative labor, like on the San Luis People's Ditch. We've ended the annual limpieza y saca de acequia as a community activity. And now each landowner is responsible, like a mutual ditch company. Well, it was really fascinating. This year, at our annual meetings, which happen in March or February, I was re-elected to my second term as a member of the Comisión for the Robert Allen Ditch. I'm president, and I'm also on the San Luis People's Ditch. And it was really interesting because the Robert Allen Ditch folks, we want to do it as a community activity, but the San Luis People's Ditch people has a majority that do not. However, there's something interesting happening, and that is that people are reevaluating those traditional norms. And that includes the SLPD. The San Luis People's Ditch is rethinking whether or not we should engage in that mutual aid and cooperative labor. A lot of people regret that we're not doing it anymore, and they wish to kick that back in. But this was a picture that I took in 2005 of the youth contingent that was helping us clean up the ditch as part of a cooperative community activity way back when it was still such a thing. I think, as was mentioned by my colega, the one irrigator, one vote is the basis of our water democracy, in contrast to the share-based indexing that's done under the appropriative doctrine. And this is one of the things that made us the most angry when we got the Acequia recognition bill passed. And that's at the Colorado Water Congress. I don't know if there's anyone from that group here, but they refused to let us do two things. One, we wanted to create Acequia conservancy districts, which would have made it a lot easier to organize ourselves. And secondly, they wouldn't allow us to say, you cannot transfer water out of the ditch. Instead, we get right of first refusal. And that's created all kinds of problems. The Acequia ecosystem services are really important. It cuts across everything from our seed saving and native land-raised crops, food production, raw materials. The natural controls we use were all organic. We were just too poor to call it that, is what we say in San Luis. Soil conservation from the riparian corridors, the amazing wildlife habitat that we create, is a really important function of the riparian corridors. The wetlands that we create from sumps, we irrigate 23,000 acres in the county. About 10,000 acres of sub-irrigated sump wetlands are a result of our flood-irrigated methods. So this is a photo from 1995 when we had an anti-logging campaign, remember, going on, and the grandfathers of the community were known as the wise old dudes for wilderness, according to the young radical environmentalists from Earth First that came to support us. This is a very interesting case because it was the first time in the history of environmental politics in the West where you had radical environmentalists and conservative ranchers and farmers on the same side of the issue. And that's because the Acequia system, the land grant struggle is about protecting the watershed. Yeah, we have use rights. We can go gather firewood. We can go graze our cows, our sheep, our other use rights. But the most important thing is the water coming off that snowpack. And that brings me to the problems, the contemporary challenges that I would like us to think and talk about. People talk about climate change or global warming. I actually see it as chaos. Climate chaos is becoming unpredictable. the strength of storms, the occurrence of storms, what's happening to the Arctic right now. But for us, it means reduced snowpack. And since we are entirely depending on snowpack spring runoff, this is really affecting us. Therefore, water rights readjudication, of the history of how discriminatory the state engineer's office has been and how it conducts itself around the abandonment lists, the loss of rights as a result of the long shadow cast by the freehold water and the Hallett Decree is a really interesting problem that we need to face as well. And in that regard, I would just say that the Hallett Decrees were issued by U.S. federal court, U.S. District Court, pardon, but it's dealing with state water rights. And that's created a lot of confusion and controversy as a result of this. I mean, when we look at the Hallett Decrees, one of the things that's overlooked, and there's a detailed discussion of this in my forthcoming book about all this, and that is that when the judge used the CFS estimates, they took it right from Edmund Cornelius Van Diest, who worked for the company that was doing the enclosure on our common lands. And he overestimated the amount of water. It was a fabrication. That entire ruling should have been held unconstitutional. But I wonder, if it is a federal court, then doesn't that invoke the 14th Amendment? And if it invokes the 14th Amendment, then can't we begin to talk about, like we did with the Rael v. Taylor case that got us back on the land, can't we be talking about this particular case as an equal rights due process case as well? We've not had our day in court, really, over the Hallett Decrees. We've not. And I think we need to talk about what that means. So, just to summarize, because I think I've got like a minute left, I'm really interested, therefore, in how we compare across these different variables. And I think it was fascinating. I don't remember when it was. When did the Ditch and Reservoir Company Alliance, DARCA, come to our community? It's been about 10 years. They came and said, we want to learn from you all. We want to be Acequias too. And you had these growers, these Mutual Ditch Company folks from all over Colorado coming to visit us, and they fell in love with our acequias. And then because from a point of governance, we love our neighbors. We treat our neighbors well. We want our neighbors to succeed. We are a water democracy, and as water and climate change affects water and makes things more difficult, that kind of neighborliness is going to be a much more important value for us. Gracias. Thank you.
Because this is when we'll have a chance to have, I hope, a great conversation based on these really wonderful presentations. If I may ask our timekeepers, how long do we have, because I know we're off schedule. 20, so that at 10:15 we will. I just want to make sure, if there are 12 hands up at that point, I want to make sure I let people know it's not personal, it's about the lack of time. All right, so if I may, I certainly have questions I would like to ask, but I would like to first invite those of you in the audience to please participate. Yes, sir.
So I know you guys have numerous reasons for continuing to flood irrigation practices, communal benefits, environmental benefits, things of that nature. But at any point in time, like if there's a shortage in the amount of available water, would any of you consider actually adopting like flooding or drip irrigation techniques or just precision irrigation methods, even if you don't use them permanently or all the time, or do you strictly want to stick with flood irrigation?
It would rob the ecosystem of the sub-irrigated flow that creates wetlands and habitat. It would upset the timing of irrigation for those of us who are not adopting drip irrigation. However, I will note, we're not resistant to change. We've adopted gated pipe, for example. So there are a lot of practices and new technologies that we're willing and are able to adopt in order to create a more hybrid system that includes acequia ditches and head gates, as well as gated pipe and so on. It just seems to me that the question of efficiency and our water rights takes our eye off the injustice of the theft of our water under the Hallett Decrees. And all we have to do is grab a hold of those winter storage rights to make adjustments to climate change and to address questions of efficiency as well. And so I'm always sort of like upset that Colorado's and even Ken Salazar, when he was Interior Secretary, oh, let's nominate the Acequias and make you a National Historical Monument. Oh, let's put up a historic marker. You're so important. Make us a line item budget on the state budget, and then we're talking. That's what we need. We need money to buy back stolen water rights, and then we can start talking about computer-aided irrigation. That's my view.
Would anyone else on the panel like to add anything?
Yes, I think I would like to say that flood irrigating is happening. However, I believe that we should probably change the actual plants that we're planting. Instead of alfalfa, which requires a lot of water, I'm a proponent of doing hemp and other marijuana plants because they use less water and they're more profitable. But that's my opinion. Okay.
Thank you. Just a quick note, we do have a microphone, and so as I ask you to ask your question, please wait until you have the microphone so that all of us can hear you.
Hello? Okay. Forgive me, Mr. Pena, if this is too naive a question on your comment about prior to prior. In our Colorado Water Law Statute, Article 16, Section 5 says, "The water of every natural stream not heretofore appropriated, State of Colorado is declared to be the property of the public and subject to these rules." When that was written into the Colorado statute long ago, wouldn't it have been true that the Acequia system had been part of the heretofore appropriated water?
Well, yeah.
Recognizing prior to prior?
Sure, but it was never officially done. That recognition never occurred. It's important to note, look, during the territorial days, the legislature passed at least 4 laws that we know about, recognizing the existence of acequias, recognizing the right of the farmers to elect their own ditch boss, recognizing the right that in times of drought, water should start going to the acequias first before any other uses. And some other minor laws were passed by the territorial legislature. And so while the territorial legislature recognized that acequias were prior to prior, we lost that after the Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch decision. And that influenced, I think, the way in which that article and others were written in. So yeah, technically you're there, but we're never specifically mentioned as an example of pre-existing water rights.
My question is, you said, somebody mentioned about LBJ and the concrete lined ditches. I guess the concrete was supposed to reduce water loss. Is that the idea of that?
There were 2 factors involved that I understand to be the case. One was there was a droughty period in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s. And the Phreatophytes were doing a good job on a lot. I mean, they were a nice riparian corridor, the willow, alder, and cottonwood, but people at the end of the San Luis Peoples Ditch were unable to operate their head gates effectively because not enough water was getting to the end of the ditch. And so it was decided by our grandparents that we would have to relocate the ditch to make it more efficient. And actually that relocation was really important because it opened up a bunch of really good sandy loam soil that had never been farmed before. And then the second thing that happened in San Luis Peoples Ditch is they cement lined it in order to get water to the end of the ditch, because it's a fairly long ditch, about 3.5 miles long, and that's why it was done. And now we're having horrendous costs trying to fix the cement as it settles and cracks and as plants break through them. And we're now talking about doing a hybrid system that would be both, some sections would be cement lined and other sections would allow for the riparian growth. Once again, if we had a restoration of water rights that were stolen, we would be able to supplement water flows to all of the ditches to make sure everyone got their share without us having to interrupt or undermine the ecological services of an unlined system.
My other question, you mentioned something about the 14th Amendment as a way of bringing about positive change for this. Oh, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, all I mean by that is that we've got equal protection due process issues in the termination of those rights. It's done by a federal court, meeting in Denver. You think people in that day could have traveled up here to be part of it? Most people didn't speak or read English. So, I mean, if we look at the cultural situation of the Parciantes in 1899, 1900, there's no way they got due process. So does that mean we can revisit that decision and we can rethink what it means? I mean, because my understanding, that water's winter storage rights for the Sanchez Ditch and Reservoir Company, part of it. And that's the water that we need to return back. There's a couple of landowners on that ditch now that it would be easy, I think relatively easy to purchase those water rights again. Although I hear rumors that T-Bone Pickens has acquired some of those rights for pure speculative reasons. But that's why I'm saying, if you're serious about conserving the Acequia way of life, then we need to have an annual state budget line item for us. And special appropriations to take those water rights out of the commodity market and put them back in the Acequia system. And I think to view it as an equal rights or due process approach would be interesting. It's not been done. It has the virtue of never been tried. Whether it would work or not, I don't know. Not a lawyer.
Hi, my question is for you, Juanita Martinez, and that is, you mentioned the rancher that had 100 acres versus you that had 5. So when you assess the fees for that, does he pay the same fee as you would on your 5 acres?
No, we have a standard acre fee. Right now, I believe it's $3.50 per acre. So he's paying more money, yes, for his acreage, but he still gets his one vote. And we pay $34, I think, or $35 a year for our 8 to 10 acres. So it's what it is. And the bigger farmer, we believe, has more opportunity to sell his products and make more money.
I can address that issue too, because this came up at our San Luis People's Ditch meeting the last 2 years, in 2017 and this year in 2018. And a lot of people on the ditch, the larger landowners, were complaining about the move to do a conversion from mutual ditch to a Acequia ditch company. And the one objection was primarily over one irrigator, one vote. That was the big hang-up. I proposed a hybrid solution. And this year people are like, oh yeah, we could do it that way. And it's very simple. On any issue affecting the assessment on the acreage, it is done share-based voting. That way the big landowners can have a bigger say, since they're the ones that are going to be affected the most. On all other matters, it's one irrigator, one vote. And people seem to be, they like this idea of a hybrid solution. And I think it is fair to the larger landowners. Most of them are fairly generous enough that we will have water assessments increase over time. I don't think they're opposed to that. But the San Luis People's Ditch is also becoming more adept at getting grant money, something we didn't used to do a lot of. So the need for increasing water assessments will probably decrease over time as more grant and hopefully Colorado State money comes into our ditches.
I should mention that there's a number of acequias in New Mexico that have adopted exactly what Devon just mentioned. It's a new idea and it's not widespread at this point, but it has been adopted among some acequias in New Mexico.
Way to solve this problem.
We have a question over here, please. They're bringing you the mic.
Great.
I'm curious, Mr. Benavides, if you could distinguish between detrimental to the public welfare and public trust doctrine.
I'm not sure I can do a great job at it. The public trust doctrine, as I understand it, is a court, federal courts or state courts have evolved a doctrine of what that comes into play in some water transactions. And I'm not even sure which transactions it necessarily applies to. Whereas public welfare, as I understand it, is a statutory criteria that state statutes have written into their state statutes as a criteria involving transfers, and that different Western states have defined it more clearly or less clearly, depending on case law, or they've added to the statutes. But it's very water code statute specific. I thought you were going to ask me a different question about the difference in the criteria between the state engineer's public welfare standard and the Acequia's standard in the Acequia statute, which is in one of the boxes, which is an Acequia can deny transfers if it's considered to be detrimental to the Acequia or its members. So anyways, that's another criteria too.
Yeah, we had a hand over here, up over here, please.
Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your comments. It says it's, there we go. I'm interested in some of the comments that have been shared so far about thinking about future generations. And in a world where we are so mobile and Colorado is experiencing so many people moving here, you have a very deep connection with the place in which you live, a querencia, right? And I'm wondering how, or what are some of the things that are being done in your local communities to help the next generation have these same kind of connections?
Let me comment on that. We are very adamant about preserving what we have as far as the water acequia systems. And we're trying to educate our young people how it works. It isn't easy today because, they think a lot different than we do. And they do a lot of this number, And they have, because of that, they have kind of lost the art of communication. So a lot of the things that we discuss with them, to them it's quick and short. Us, we want to give a whole explanation. So that's where the difference comes in trying to teach them how the system works. And in the event that they want to come back, whenever, the land and the water will be there. That's what we're trying to do, is preserve it for future generations. It's very important for us. And we fight very hard to make that happen. But in reference to young people, if we don't teach them what we know, it could very well become a lost art of irrigating. And it's really sad because when I irrigate, I find it very soothing. I love to be out there and just watering and looking at the mountains, looking at how the water flows. And like it was mentioned earlier, the gate system came out, later. And I was fortunate to be able to install gated water system in mine about 3 years ago. What it is just a 12-inch diameter piping with a lot of little gates that you open and close. And you have to have a water gate where it starts, where the water comes in, and then you, the good thing about irrigating with these pipes is that you have better control of the water when you flood irrigate, because you can do it in sections, once your whole pipe is filled up. But those are the things that we're trying to get our young people to understand, that they need to know all of that in the event that they want to come back to the land. And we're hoping that that'll happen, because we have a grandson that's 26 years old, and he's lived with us there for a year, and he liked it very much, but he had to go back to work. And he's thinking of eventually coming back, and that's the reason why we're trying to preserve the acequia system.
Allow me to add a little bit to that, and maybe engage in a little bit of shameless self-promotion too. The Acequia Institute is very focused on mentoring the next generation. And we invest a lot of resources in that. We're about to launch a campaign to build a campus, the first campus of El Calmeca Colegio del Maíz, the University of Corn, which will be training Native American and other Chicano and other Native American students for the future generation of corn growers and protectors. And to me, it would be really tragic. It looks like we can win the land war. I mean, we restored the use rights to the mountain, to the land grant. We've won a lot of water fights, and we'll continue, I think, to strengthen our position in terms of Acequia water law and water rights. But if we don't take care of the next generation, there's not going to be anyone to irrigate on that land. And you can't blame them. Joe Gallegos once told me, Acequia farming is not an occupation, it's a way of life. And I think he's really right, that I mean, most of us have other jobs. Right. We do acequias because it's a way of life. It's not that we're going to make a living from acequia farms. The only ranchers that make a living are the cattle people. You know, that's it. And maybe some of us, like myself, who have a lot of organic hay for sale. But other than that, it's a way of life. And getting the youth to see that, I think, is a real challenge, because they live in a world that's discriminating against them, that's going to make it tough for them to even have an occupation. So when you can't even get an occupation, how can you think about a way of life? And I think it's going to take a lot of work on our part to try to bring our youth back into it. And I think we're doing a good job with the Sembrando Semillas project. Back in the old days, in the 90s, when La Sierra Foundation was around, we used to have environmental education retreats on the mountain to bring youth to connect back to the land and water and wildlife. And so that's a huge part of what we're doing with the Universidad del Maíz. And also we offer scholarships to the children of Acequia farmers, their tuition scholarships for college. And we also support grad students doing research on acequia farming. So I'm proud of the fact that we're a very small nonprofit, but since 2006, we've done about $100,000 worth of this, just based on our own endowment income. So please support us when you can to support the Acequia Institute to continue doing that work.
And I just wanted to mention that when I spoke about changing crops, my grandson told us that hemp may be the plant of the future, and I believe it is. I'm absolutely sold on that idea. And he says that the plants will produce more per acre as far as monetary gain, and they can probably sustain themselves well enough to be able to enjoy a way of life. But we also, in our community, every year we have the limpieza, which means the cleaning. We clean out our ditches, and this next Saturday, the 7th of April, our community is having an acequia cleaning, and we partnered with the Connect to Walk people, and he's here, and he has connected us with a group of refugee Africans who are also water and land-based people, and they're going to come into our community and interact with our community kids, and they're going to help clean up our acequia. So when kids start saying, oh, woe is me, my life is the pits, when they hear a story of a refugee, that attitude leaves. So we believe that the interconnectedness is important. We would have never done this even a couple of years ago, and the reason why is because we're so closed. We're closed people. We're so afraid of the thievery and the misrepresentations we get. It's hard. And my husband and I just said, we got to do something to make life better for our little community and the kids we have. By the way, we only have 8 kids in our village. And I needed to say that the Acequia Institute supports our little program, and they're supporting it wholeheartedly, and I appreciate that help. Thank you.
And on that note, I'd like to invite us to take our break and to continue the conversation. I want to thank all of our panelists. I really very much appreciate the contributions that each of you made, and I look forward to further conversation.
So we're going to take a